The desert had swallowed whole towns before, yet Abigail Moore had never seen it swallow a ship. From the saddle she blinked against the glare and squinted across the dunes. At first she thought it a mirage, a long wooden hull half buried in gold sand, ribs jutting like bones. She reined in her gelding, Scout, and shaded her eyes. The thing did not vanish. There, far from any river, lay a weathered vessel with a broken mast pointing at the pitiless sky. Heat shimmered around it, as if the sea itself had evaporated and left only this stubborn memory. Curiosity overruled caution. Abigail nudged Scout forward, letting his hooves sink and hiss through the soft sand. The closer she rode, the stranger the scene became. Planks where there should be stones, tarred rope instead of sage, iron nails glinting like cactus spines. She dismounted, boots sinking to the ankle, and laid her palm against the hull. The timber was sun-hot, dry and smooth where wind had burnished it to satin. "How did you get here?" she whispered. Wind whistled through cracked seams, answering with a low, breathy note that felt like history exhaled from an old chest lid. She ducked beneath a warped beam and slipped inside the shadowed belly. Dust swirled in angled sunbeams, a galaxy turning slowly within the ribs. Crates lay upside down, lids split, corners gnawed by time. A rope ladder hung brittle as winter grass. Abigail moved carefully, shoulder-brushing timbers that creaked like sleeping animals. Far forward, she found a cramped cabin with a narrow bunk and a desk buried in sand. On its surface lay a small brass plate, stamped with a name, The Morning Star. She traced the letters and felt respect rise, simple and solemn as prayer that lingered. In a drawer that stuck halfway open, she found a leather journal, edges cracked like riverbeds in drought. She carried it into the light, sat on a broken crate, and turned the first careful page. Ink had faded, but a steady hand survived. Mentions of storms, drift, land too far west, thirst, crew growing weaker, captain praying for mercy. Abigail read slowly, lips moving with the cadence of a stranger's hope. She was not chasing treasure. She wanted the story intact, a truth she could hold. She closed the cover gently, as if laying a tired sailor to sleep here. Outside, heat pressed like a hand. Abigail tethered Scout within the ship's long shade and shared a mouthful of water with him. The hull cast a cool stripe across the sand, a mercy line in a ruthless world. She ate jerky, rolled her shoulders, and listened to the faint answering creak inside the planks. The desert was never quiet. It simply hid its voices. Here, another voice joined, timber speaking in sighs. She felt less alone. She set the journal beneath her hat, breathed slow, and let the ship teach her patience, one warm, patient heartbeat at a time today. She made camp between the ribs, stretching canvas from spar to spar until a small tent found anchor. Old planks became a windbreak, and a shallow fire pit glowed with gathered brush. At dusk, she brushed Scout, counted her beans, and read the journal by lantern light. Each entry felt like a footstep beside her, steady and human. There were no miracles on the pages, only choices marked by hunger, maps, and weather. She respected that. When night cooled the iron sky, she lay awake listening to the hull expand and settle, wood remembering water, while sand remembered weight well. Morning brightened the dunes into hammered gold. Abigail climbed to the highest ridge and studied the way they curled around the wreck like frozen waves. Nothing else interrupted the horizon. No windmill, no cottonwoods, no glimmering river to justify a keel. She laughed despite herself. A small sound whisked away by air. Back below, she inventoried the hull piece by piece, imagining repairs a sea would demand and a desert would forbid. In a seam near the bulkhead, something metal scraped her knuckles. She pried loose a small tin box and sat cross-legged in the shade to open it. Inside lay 3 coins, worn smooth, a brass button, and a folded map on brittle paper. Abigail breathed slowly and opened it along the cracked seams. Not a chart of coasts, but a land sketch. 2 buttes like teeth, a crooked wash, a star near a canyon bend. Someone had drawn distances with a careful hand, as if future feet would need faithful guidance. She traced the star with her thumb and felt a flicker of purpose. This was no fantasy. It was direction. She tucked the map into her satchel, feeling the welcome weight of an unfinished errand ahead. By afternoon, the heat felt hammered from iron, but Abigail saddled Scout and followed the lines the map suggested. She kept to the ridges where wind thinned the sand and paused often to match shapes with doodled marks. 2 buttes finally rose ahead, stubborn silhouettes exactly where they should be. Between them, a dry wash twisted south, half filled with pale stones polished by water long gone. She dismounted, leading Scout carefully over shale. The canyon mouth hid until she stood directly above it, a narrow slit in the earth, dark and cool, like a secret taught to whisper home. She slid down on her side, boots scraping, palms braced against the rock. The air cooled 10 degrees in the shade, and the world's noise softened to a hush. At the bottom, stones lay smooth as river pebbles, mottled blue and gray. She knelt and sifted sand through her fingers, feeling faint, damp far below. Once, water had ruled here. Maybe sailors had camped a day too late. Abigail stood and followed the bend until a shelf opened like a room. In the wall, someone had hammered an iron ring long ago. She touched the cold circle and understood distance. She climbed out as the sky bruised purple and gold, lungs burning, pockets full of quiet. Scout nickered when she crested the dune, and Abigail rubbed his forelock gratefully. Back at camp, she lit a small fire, warmed beans, and opened the journal to the final pages. She read aloud to the wreck and the wind, a habit for nights that needed company. "If we perish here," the hand had written, "let it be known we tried." Abigail closed the book and whispered, "You did." Above her, stars blinked awake. Ancient eyes, kindly ignoring how far from water she, Saturday. Morning found her unwilling to leave. She rigged a better shade by lashing canvas to ribs and staked her tent against spiteful gusts. Old boards became a table, a kinked nail, a hook for her cup. She cleaned sand from the captain's desk until the wood showed a faint, stubborn shine. The wreck was not treasure, yet it gave generously. Shelter, stories, and a line between harsh sun and bearable shade. That afternoon she mended tack, then wrote in her own notebook, careful block letters describing dunes like waves, wood like bone, courage like salt. Staying felt earned today, too. Word travels even where roads do not. A pair of drovers spotted the hull one evening and rode in grinning, asking what kind of fool built a barn with a keel. Abigail poured coffee, traded stories, and refused coins for planks. "She's earned her rest," she said, patting the timber. They nodded, left jerky and gossip, and promised to spread the tale of the cowgirl who camped in a ship. More came weeks later, a widow on a burro, a prospector with kind hands, a boy chasing horizon. They stayed an hour, left lighter, and the desert felt less empty. Abigail began to speak to the hull as if it were an elder relative, stubborn and dependable. She thanked it for shade, scolded it for splinters, asked it to hold through the night. In return, it answered with creaks, pops, and the soft, long sigh of timber cooling. She understood the language. On the frontier, survival was a conversation. Each evening she noted wind direction, counted stars east of the mast stump, and planned chores enough for 2 lifetimes. The ship had traveled farther than anyone intended. So had she. In that truth, she found company she could trust fully. The sandstorm arrived without prelude, a tan wall rising where horizon used to be. Abigail shoved gear under canvas, tied down the journal, and dragged Scout into the lee of the hull. Wind hit like fists, Sand needled her cheeks, filled ears, turned breath to grit. The ship groaned, bones remembering ocean commas and periods, hours thudded by in roaring darkness. She counted aloud to anchor herself, spoke Scout's name, whispered lines from the sailor's pages. When the wind finally fell asleep, dawn found the bow deeper, half swallowed, but standing. Abigail laughed once, hoarse and grateful, then slept hard. She woke sore, shook sand from her blanket, and walked the dunes to measure what the night had taken. The tent was ragged, one stake gone, the map nowhere. The journal, wrapped in oilcloth, had stayed put, exactly where she left it. That felt like permission. She brewed coffee thin as courage and considered whether to hunt the canyon again. The truth arrived plain. She didn't need treasure. She needed purpose. The ship had already given that generously. She spent the day straightening canvas, repairing lashings, and salvaging boards the storm had uncovered, treating ruin like a kind of harvest. Using the freed boards, Abigail built a taller windbreak, then a slatted rack to dry meat and gear. She stitched a rain catcher from canvas scraps, because even desert skies occasionally remember generosity. She repaired the captain's door and set it upright on stones for a table. Small beauty followed function. A cup hung on a nail, a scarf pinned where breeze could speak, the journal kept under a clean cloth. She caught herself humming an old trail tune. Work changed the air. The wreck no longer seemed stranded. It felt anchored. She finally understood the difference deep inside herself. 2 riders returned at dusk, the same men who had once offered to buy her boards. They looked at the storm's new dunes and shook their heads like preachers at foolishness. Abigail poured coffee, handed tin cups, and heard the offer again, sweeter and larger. She smiled without accepting. "This place belongs to the stories it carries," she said. "I am only the caretaker." They stared, then laughed softly, perhaps understanding more than they admitted. When they left, one set a small sack of nails on her table. Payment for nothing, or everything. She waved them off into violet dark. That night the air cooled sweet as well water. Abigail lay on her bedroll within the ribs and watched moonlight draw pale rivers along the planks. She thought of the sailor's last line and answered it quietly. Trying mattered. Her own trail had looked senseless to others. A woman camping with a ship in sand, but meaning is a private map. She had found direction in work and kinship in timber that refused to quit. The desert still demanded caution, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like a teacher, rough-handed, patient, speaking through wind, wood, and time. At dawn, she saddled Scout, but did not mount. Instead, she walked him to the prow and stood beneath the broken mast, letting sunrise polish both of them with thin gold. The ship would never move again, and neither did she need to. Movement was not the only proof of life. She tightened the guy line, checked the water, and opened the journal to a blank page. Her pencil waited. The West loved beginnings that looked like ends. Abigail smiled, wrote the date, and started a new entry. Camp Morning Star, Day 1. The desert listened. The story kept breathing nearby. Weeks slipped by like sand through fingers. Abigail Moore rose with the sun and worked until the stars returned. She patched cracks in the hull with tar and clay, built a small corral for Scout, and hung a tin cup on the mast for luck. The wreck had stopped being a curiosity. It was now her home. Travelers who passed by no longer asked what she was doing there. They brought coffee, news, and quiet respect. A ship in the desert was madness to some, but for Abigail, it was survival. It reminded her that everything lost could still be rebuilt. Sometimes, she imagined the sailors who had died here. She would talk to them while she worked, telling them how their old vessel had become shelter for a cowgirl and her horse. "You built her to fight the sea," she'd say softly, hammering a board into place. Turns out, she fights sand just as well. The wind would whistle through the broken mast, and she liked to believe they heard her. In their failure, she had found purpose. That seemed fair. In the desert, purpose mattered more than profit. It was the only thing that kept the heart steady. As weeks turned to months, green shoots began to appear, where she poured water near the base of the wreck. Tiny plants clawed life from dust. Abigail smiled at them every morning, whispering, "You're braver than most people I know." The land slowly softened under her care. She repaired the old rain barrel she'd found in the hull, collected every drop that fell. Scout grew sleek again, his ribs hidden beneath healthy muscle. Even the birds had returned, small brown sparrows nesting in the mast. It was strange, but the more she gave the desert, the more it gave back. Then, one afternoon, as the wind calmed to a low hum, she saw a figure walking across the dunes. At first she thought it a trick of light, but the shape grew solid, a young man, limping, clutching something against his chest. Scout neighed uneasily. Abigail rested a hand on her rifle, but didn't lift it. "Easy," she whispered to her horse. When the man reached her camp, he collapsed beside the ship, his face pale, eyes sunburned. Abigail knelt, offered him water. He drank greedily, gasping thanks between swallows. "Name's Elias," he croaked. "Didn't think I'd find anyone out here." Abigail studied him carefully. His clothes were torn, boots cracked, and a small leather satchel hung from his shoulder. "You're lucky you did," she said, offering him bread. "There's not much else out here but wind and ghosts." He smiled weakly. "Then I guess you're both." When he could stand again, she helped him to the shade of the hull. He told her he'd been searching for an old survey trail, something his father once mapped before disappearing. "I thought I'd find proof he made it," he said. Abigail's chest tightened. She understood searching for what time had buried too well. That evening they shared coffee and stories. Elias spoke of towns far east, of rivers that still ran, of places where people laughed in the streets. Abigail listened, smiling faintly. Sounds almost too good to be true. He looked at her camp, the patched boards, the simple fire, the ship rising like a monument behind her, and said, "Maybe so, but you've built something just as rare." She followed his gaze, seeing the place anew. A ship that should have died, now alive again, sheltering two strangers who had both lost their way. For once, loneliness didn't sting. It healed. Days passed easily. Elias regained strength, helping her gather brush and mend planks. He was younger, but his hands bore the same calluses as hers, the kind made by tools and survival. They spoke little when working. Silence was a comfortable language. At night, they'd sit on overturned crates, watching stars spill across the black sky. "Your ship's something else," he said once. "Most folks would have torn it apart for firewood." Abigail smirked. "Most folks ain't me." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "No, you're built out of stronger stuff than pine and nails." She didn't argue. He was right. One morning, while checking the ridge, Elias found something half buried in sand, a piece of metal, curved and green with age. He brought it back and set it on her makeshift table. "Looks like copper," he said. "Part of the old cargo, maybe." Abigail turned it in her hands. On the surface was a faint engraving, a crest of some sort. "Seems your father wasn't the only one mapping things that got lost," she murmured. He nodded, thoughtful. They decided to dig near the stern, where the boards were loose. By dusk, they uncovered 3 crates bound with rusted iron bands. The crates were heavy, the wood soft but intact. Abigail pried one open carefully. Inside lay dull metal rods wrapped in cloth tools, not treasure. The second held surveying instruments, compasses, and journals sealed in wax. Elias's hands trembled as he lifted one. These look like my father's," he whispered. The third crate was empty except for a single brass sextant, its glass still clear. Abigail felt her throat tighten. "Looks like your search ended here." Elias nodded slowly, or began again. They spent the evening reading the journals by firelight, tracing a story written decades before either was born. The writings told of explorers trying to map the last rivers before drought claimed them, of promises to return with news of salvation. Some entries ended mid-sentence, ink faded by dust. Elias read them aloud, his voice low and reverent. Abigail watched the firelight dance on his face and thought how every dream, even the ones that die, leaves behind a seed for someone else to find. She closed the book gently. He wasn't lost, she said. He just ran out of time. Elias smiled sadly. And now I've found where his story stopped, thanks to you. The following days were quiet, filled with simple work patching, cooking, collecting firewood. Elias planned to take the journals back east, to publish his father's maps, maybe finish what he started. Abigail helped him gather supplies, her chest heavy with a strange ache. She had grown used to another heartbeat near her campfire. But she'd always known he would leave. The desert never let anyone stay forever, unless they belonged to it. When you go, she said one morning, take what's worth keeping. Leave the rest. The ship's got plenty of ghosts already. He smiled softly. And one angel. He left at dawn 2 days later. Scout watching silently as his figure shrank into the dunes. Abigail stood by the broken mast, long after the horizon swallowed him. The wind blew harder that day, scattering sand across the deck. She let it. Life in the desert was built on acceptance of coming, leaving, and all the silence between. When she returned to her camp, she found something new on her table. The brass sextant, polished and gleaming in the morning light. Beneath it, a note in his careful handwriting, for the captain who keeps lost souls steady. She laughed and cried. Weeks passed again, and the seasons turned. Rain came in short bursts, carving faint streams through the sand before vanishing. Grass sprouted where the water pooled, softening the edges of the wreck. Birds nested, and wildflowers bloomed yellow and white among the dunes. The morning star no longer looked like a ruin. It looked lived in, loved. Abigail sat beneath its shadow, carving a new name into the wood. Home. When travelers came now, they found her smiling, ready with coffee and stories. The desert still demanded respect, but it had stopped demanding her sorrow. She had earned her peace. Sometimes at dusk she would climb the ridge and watch the sun drop behind the dunes. She'd imagine Elias somewhere far away, maybe standing by a real river holding his father's maps. She liked to think he still looked up at the stars the same way she did, guided by the same light. The wind carried his name softly across the sand sometimes, or maybe that was just memory. Either way, she smiled. The desert had taken her loneliness and turned it into legacy. That was all anyone could hope for, to leave something standing when everything else sank. One night, a group of writers stopped by her camp. They spoke of a new settlement growing a few days' ride east, a town called Star's End. Named after some wreck, I reckon, one said, sipping coffee. Abigail chuckled quietly. Sounds like a good name to me. When they left, she walked to the ship's bow and ran her fingers over the carved letters of Morning Star. Looks like you've finally got your harbor, she whispered. The hull creaked in answer, the same way it always had. Somewhere out there, a name had become a town, and the story kept sailing. Years later, gray streaked Abigail's hair, and the ship had sunk a little deeper into the sand. Still, she kept it tidy, swept the deck, mended the boards that wine tore loose, talked to it when nights felt long. People came from miles around just to see the ship in the sand. They brought flowers, coins, stories, even children who ran laughing through the ribs. Abigail watched them with quiet joy. The world had changed, but this place remained not a ruin but a reminder that anything, even lost souls and broken ships, could find purpose under the same Sunday. One afternoon, A familiar figure approached from the horizon, older, slower, but unmistakably Elias. He carried a rolled parchment and the same quiet smile. "Didn't think I'd see her again," he said, patting the hull. "Neither did I," Abigail replied. He handed her the parchment. It was a printed map, rivers redrawn, trails renamed, towns marked where there'd been none before. In one corner, the legend read, "The Morning Star Expedition completed." Abigail's eyes filled. "So he found his way home after all?" Elias nodded. "Because you gave me mine." They sat beneath the mast until sunset painted them gold. When night came, they built a fire and listened to the wind. It sang softly through the ship's ribs, the same note she'd heard the first day she found it. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. Abigail smiled faintly. "I did once, but this place needs someone who remembers why it still stands." He nodded. "Then I guess you're the captain now." She laughed quietly. "Always was." The fire cracked, and in its glow, the wreck no longer looked like a ship stranded in sand. It looked like a beacon that refused to fade. The years continued kindly. Abigail's hair turned white, her hands lined and strong. She spent her mornings tending small gardens between the dunes, and her evenings writing in the sailor's journal, adding her story beside theirs. Travelers still came, ranchers, wanderers, dreamers, each leaving something behind: a coin, a poem, a handful of seeds. The Morning Star became a legend, a symbol of endurance in a land that swallowed everything but courage. And when storms came, people said they could still see a light glowing faintly from the dunes. Lanterns hung from an old mast, guiding souls home.